Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into one of American history's absolute biggest broken rules. We're going to explore a truly fascinating and honestly pretty troubling scenario: what actually happens when a legal referee makes a definitive, game-changing call but has absolutely no whistle to enforce it. We're looking at a moment where the very foundation of the United States justice system was put to the ultimate test. So think about this for a second. If a court makes a ruling, but nobody actually enforces it, did it even matter? It's a massive gap, right? The gap between writing a law down on paper and actually backing it up with real-world action. Because a rule is really only as strong as the power that's willing to stand behind it. When that power vanishes, well, the rule of law itself begins to crumble.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover the clash over Cherokee land, the Supreme Court's decision, the defiance of the rule of law, the states' rights debate, why enforcement truly matters, and wrap up with morality, education, and justice.
All right, part one, the clash over Cherokee land.
Picture this. The state of Georgia decides it's going to just impose its own state laws onto Cherokee territory. Now, the huge problem here is that the Cherokee Nation was a completely distinct, sovereign political community. But Georgia aggressively claimed authority over lands that fundamentally did not belong to them, legally or politically. It was a massive overreach. They basically ignored the established sovereignty of the Cherokee people, and that set the stage for an intense collision between a rapidly growing state and a sovereign native nation.
Which brings us to part two, the Supreme Court decides. The crucial turning point here hits in 1832 with the landmark case Worcester v. Georgia. Chief Justice John Marshall and his court step in and make a definitive ruling. Georgia's laws have absolutely no force in Cherokee territory. None. The court formally recognized the Cherokee Nation as a distinct political community, meaning that only the federal government, not an individual state like Georgia, had the constitutional authority to negotiate with them. To really grasp the weight of this, imagine being a sovereign nation constantly pressured by local politicians, only to have the highest court in the land step up and completely validate your legal existence. It was a monumental, unprecedented legal victory for native sovereignty. But then we hit part three. The rule of law defied. Let's look at how fast this devolves into a complete disaster. In 1830, Georgia passes laws to seize power. 2 years later, in 1832, the Supreme Court definitively rules in favor of the Cherokee. But then, 1833 rolls around, and Georgia just ignores the ruling. They literally pretend it didn't happen and continue their aggressive takeaway. And as the years go on, federal protection never arrives. The executive branch of the U.S. government completely failed to provide the muscle needed to enforce the court's decree. The decision was just ignored, which deeply harmed the very people the ruling was meant to protect. And it exposed a terrifying constitutional vulnerability. Court decisions, no matter how legally bulletproof, are entirely dependent on the executive branch to actually enforce them. Let's look at why in part four, states' rights and nullification. To understand how Georgia got away with this, we have to talk about states' rights. This was the core excuse Georgia used to justify doing whatever it wanted within its borders, completely bypassing the Supreme Court. The whole debate centered on a fundamental question of federalism. Who actually gets the final say in interpreting and applying national law? Can state power just override federal authority whenever a state finds a federal ruling politically inconvenient? Well, Georgia certainly thought so. And this just brilliantly highlights the hypocrisy of the era. On one hand, you have President Andrew Jackson allowing Georgia to trample native sovereignty by flat-out refusing to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling. But then, on the other hand, during the Nullification Crisis, which was when South Carolina tried to void a federal tariff they didn't like, Jackson forcefully stepped in, rejected their claim, and fiercely defended national law with the literal threat of military force. Talk about whiplash, right? This stark contrast perfectly reveals how inconsistent these political choices were. The states' rights argument could cut in completely different directions depending entirely on the issue, the political climate, and honestly just the sheer will of the executive branch. Moving to part five, why enforcement truly matters. There's a really profound reminder in the book of Amos, chapter 5, verse 24. It says, "Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." True justice is so much more than just written words on a piece of parchment or a decree echoing from a judge's bench. It demands active, never-failing enforcement. A healthy republic has to agree not just on what the rules are, but on who is obligated to enforce them. Worcester v. Georgia shows us exactly what happens when political convenience overrides legal duty. Without enforcement, the river of justice simply dries up.
So, before we wrap up the historical side of this explainer, let's do a quick mental check. To truly master this topic, you should now be able to summarize the Worcester v. Georgia decision. You should be able to explain exactly why the executive branch failed to enforce it. You should know how to define the states' rights argument, contrast this situation with the nullification crisis, and clearly articulate why the rule of law absolutely requires courts to make rulings and an executive branch to actually take action. If you've got those down, you have a rock-solid grasp on the real-world mechanics of the separation of powers.
Finally, Part 6. Morality, Education, and Justice.
This ties perfectly into a concept from the HeroSmart Academy Godly Learners series, which teaches us that education without morality will inevitably cause hurt. Think back to those leaders from the 1830s we've been talking about. These were highly educated, legally brilliant men. They knew the Constitution inside and out, and yet they stood by and allowed a vulnerable community to be harmed because they lacked the moral fortitude to enforce the law when it got politically tricky. Seriously, what is the point of being incredibly smart and highly educated if you're just going to make choices that hurt people? Intelligence without a moral anchor usually just becomes a tool for unchecked power.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. Romans 8:6-7 promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their mind spiritual. True peace and true justice only happen when we intertwine our learning with biblical morality. People who actually engage with this philosophy experience it firsthand. So I'm going to leave you with this final, crucial question to chew on. As you learn the mechanics of history, law, and power, will your education be guided by a moral compass, ensuring your intelligence is used to uphold justice rather than ignore it? Think about that, and I'll see you in the next explainer.